Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe. And later on we're going to be talking to US educator Starr Sackstein, and we had a fantastic conversation with her about formative assessment and various other things. And talking to her made me really think about kind of the fascinating array of issues that we get to deal with as teachers. And then what's on my mind a lot at the moment is why we can't get more people into teaching. Why isn't it the thing in the profession, and then keeping people in it? And there's recent data in the UK which is saying that after 5 years, only 67% of teachers are still in the job. And there must be reasons for that. And for me, there's so many things I wish I knew before I became a teacher about how great it is to be a teacher. And I would have been running to the job much more readily. But now I do know about it. I feel like I'm selling it. If my kids told me they wanted to be teachers, I'd be thrilled. Whereas I think 20 years ago, I'd have been worried, and now there's something missing there, isn't there? There's a message we're not getting across about why teaching is the great job that it is. And then when we've got teachers, what is it that's happening which means they don't want to stay? What do you think, Emma? I mean, this has been something that I know that it's very close to your heart.
Yeah, I mean, I work a lot with early career teachers, and I'm always talking about how teaching is the greatest job in the world. And we interviewed Alison Peacock, who obviously is Chartered College of Teaching, and one of her roles is to raise the status of the profession, to sort of say, teaching really is the greatest profession of all. Without teaching, there are no other professions, because we are the educators of every other profession that grows into every other profession. And it's interesting, the doctoral research that Dr. Emma Kell did when she wrote her book, How to Survive in Teaching, there's some absolutely startling statistics in there about why, although teaching is the most, consistently comes out as the most trusted profession after doctors, why so many people leave. And it's such a huge sort of combination of the way they're portrayed in the media, the perception that they have in society. It's absolutely huge. And she talks about the demographics that leave as well. It's interesting that the biggest demographic that leaves after retirees is women aged between 31 and 40. So is it that we're losing teachers because the job's not flexible enough? So is it an infrastructure change that needs to happen? And she talks very much about, the reasons behind why people leave. She originally started off looking at parental, being a teacher parent, but actually morphed into this how to survive in teaching. So if you want to sort of delve into the statistics, have a look at her work. But I don't know, from being in the job, I can't imagine doing a job that I would love more. There are very few where you spend the morning singing, lunchtime running around with a rounder's bat, the afternoon doing maths, and then it's such a varied, especially in primary, such a varied, joyful job. I genuinely don't understand why.
I've got lots of friends who have jobs which seem, I don't know, glamorous on the outside, like working in the film industry or something. But actually, when you describe what they do all day, and I actually think it sounds pretty mundane a lot of the time. And then when I was thinking about, a job where you get to work with people, interesting people, crazy characters, you're intellectually challenged because you've got to think about how to explain something. You constantly have to read about it. There's all this research and the nature of research, cognitive science, the nature of your subject, the emotional aspect of it. It's like, whoa, there's so many aspects. And then there's the organizational side, which is, the leadership dimension. You're running a small team, a bigger team, a whole system. It's totally fascinating. Plus, it's got this kind of moral purpose. Teaching matters. It's important. And it's on the front line. We're doing the business. So all of these things that ought to be like massively celebrated. So why don't maybe we stuff it up, because when we've got people, we make it too hard. We're too hard on teachers, and we make it too hard, and perhaps that's the thing we need to be working on.
I do think the accountability structures are huge. I mean, I think back to when I first started teaching, and although there was no PPA, no NQT time to speak of, release time for newly qualified teachers, it was still a job that was doable, and nobody was kind of hitting me with a big metaphorical accountability stick. Nobody was asking me for tons of data. Nobody was coming into my lessons constantly telling me that I was either good, bad, indifferent, whatever. And I look back now and I think about the learning that I did early on in my career, and there were lessons that we will never speak of again. But it happened in the quiet of my own classroom where I could reflect on those and go, learned quite a lot from that. Whereas now I think we forget that being an early career teacher, a novice teacher, you're going to make lots of mistakes, and from those mistakes comes learning. But I think that potentially they've not got the same freedom to make those mistakes that we potentially had all those years ago. And it can be incredibly draining and incredibly difficult for an early career teacher to feel like they are doing a good job and they are making a difference and they are having that kind of enjoyment of the job when they've got this spectre of accountability sort of sitting on their shoulder.
I agree with that. It perhaps needs to be a much stronger part of, say, leadership development programs and so on, where you think, how do we nurture a staff body? You need to have levels of progression. You need to be very encouraging relentlessly, because if you think that the best way to get people to stay under pressure to sort of crack the whip, it's probably not going to work. And there is a balance between creating a kind of positive pressure of that it all matters and we need to do a good job without making it feel unmanageable. I think that's, is it getting better? Are we getting better at, say, respecting people's weekends and workload? Or is it better than it was 5 years ago or so, do you think?
I definitely think the conversations are starting. Before, it was a kind of work till you drop, why can't you keep up kind of culture in a lot of places. Now, especially with books like Cat Howard, Stop Talking About Wellbeing, I think the well-being conversation is being had around the education table, and from conversation will come action. So I think that just the fact that everybody started to talk means that there will be movement now. And I think the pandemic as well has shone a light on the fact that actually a lot of it can be cut out, and people can be trusted to do work and still to develop and still to progress without having so many accountability structures layered on around them.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, so it's obviously, I think it's a thing we come up around to quite often in our program. And I think later on you'll see evidence of a teacher who's kind of in their prime when we meet Starr Sackstein in a few moments. But that's fantastic. Thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the show. Hello, welcome back, everybody. We're delighted to have with us today Starr Sackstein, who is a very well-known educator in the US and the author of a fantastic book called Hacking Assessment. And we're going to be asking her about that. She's famous for her ideas about gradeless teaching, and we want to get stuck into that. So welcome, Starr. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks so much.
I'm going to kick off. I've been looking into some of the stuff you've done. I was immediately drawn to this a blog post you wrote. You do quite a lot of blogging, and it's quite hard to keep up with everything you do, actually. But I was drawn to this acronym, which struck out straight away, TTOG. I thought, what is this? And I looked it up, and it goes to a Facebook page, which is called Teachers Tossing Out Grades. I thought, you even have a Facebook group dedicated to this thing. So I just thought, I want to know what this is about. Why is it such a big deal? And bearing in mind some of our listeners, viewers are from the UK as well as the US, what's it all about? Just give us an introduction to this concept of gradelessness and what it means to you.
Okay, so I guess a bunch of years ago, I was in the classroom for 16 years before I became a leader, and then after I was a leader, I'm consulting now. But when I was in the classroom, I noticed that grading in the traditional sense was not doing my students any service. Especially working with underserved populations who are used to sort of not hearing, getting their voices heard. I noticed that when I went about doing things the way that I was raised and through the system that I went through, there's a lot of box checking, points taken off or added for a lot of compliance related issues that have nothing to do with academic progress. And the more I started thinking about, at the time I was teaching AP English, so like college level English in high school, I thought about all the skills we were learning, the kind of literature we were tackling, and I was thinking about how we reported learning in that space. And when we were reporting learning, I got 1 grade. And the way report cards work in the New York City school system where I taught, they had like numbered comments that were pre-slugged, like they were already there. I just had to pick the number, bubble it in, and then that's what they got on their report card. Whatever grade I put on there with these 3 comments, like participates well in class, needs to turn in work, something really generic like that. And the issue with like averaging and my students in the space, like I could give 10 kids a B, and that B could mean something very different for each of those 10 kids. And it started to become really problematic for me because I don't know, it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel like I was communicating what they knew and can do. And they often could do a lot more than that grade suggested. So what ended up happening is I started going away from tests, started doing alternative assessments, started adding reflection into everything we did in the classroom, started having conferences with them at midpoint in the semester and then endpoint so that we could look at their portfolio of learning and decide together what should go on the report card so that there was a more authentic experience. Because in New York City schools, even though I wasn't grading all the time, the report card was still required. So hacking assessment really talks about loopholes that you could kind of get into, even if you have to give a grade at the end and you really don't want to, but there are more equitable ways to do it so that kids' voices are involved in that decision-making process. And the TTOG group was really Mark Barnes's brainchild, and he and I were writing similar stuff at the same time, and we're on a panel for Corwin's Connected Educator series. He had written a book about teaching the I student, and I had written a book about blogging, and we were put on a panel together and we kind of hit it off and had the same values about grading. He had written Assessment 3.0 and Role Reversal, and I had read both of those books, and our philosophies just really gelled. We're like, it would be a really great thing to have a community of folks who really believe strongly about this. And, there's certainly power and strength in numbers. And if we could get more and more folks together and on board, we could maybe shift the system a little bit.
It's just like, do you feel like you're sort of fighting the machine? I mean, do you feel like this movement is sort of quite small and it's against the grain, or is it actually quite well established? I don't have a sense of how big a thing it is.
Well, I would say, there are more than 10,000 people in the group now, but certainly when you think about the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of teachers in New York City alone, I think we're very much against the grain. I think the pandemic in the United States right now has gotten people really thinking about the way they assess, because traditional stuff isn't working in this environment. So I think out of necessity, people are looking into other ways of handling it, and therefore we've attracted a lot of attention right now because this is stuff we were doing already. But very much so, when I was in the high school that I was in, I was working alone. A lot of my colleagues, although they respected me, certainly thought I was the kook in the classroom down the block over there, where espousing all kinds of crazy things that I don't think they really understood, but they also saw that the kids were responding well to it, and I was getting good results. So, you can't really argue with results, fortunately.
No.
I watched your TED Talk today, and out in the sunshine, having a lovely time until no reflection on the TED Talk. So my 6-year-old threw up all over the patio. So I missed the end. I missed the end of your TED Talk, which I will watch. But I was watching it and I was thinking, this is absolutely fascinating. And it took me back to a place in my own career where I was furious, absolutely furious. So I used to work in year 6 over here, which is the last year of primary before they transitioned to secondary. And I had a brilliant transition colleague in year 7 who used to come down every year, ask me all about the children, how they learned, what they were interested in, if they had older siblings, what kind of family support they had. And I used to love that. It was great. And they changed that person in the school, and he came down to school with a spreadsheet and he said, I want you to grade the children from A to E in this, from 1 to 5 in this. And I absolutely lost it. I was just like, you can't do this to my children. These are people. So I was watching your TED talk thinking, this is exactly the argument that I was having at a transition from primary to secondary. And then I became fascinated about what actually is a grade school, because obviously you have those in America, but our system's very different here. So for our kind of UK viewers, if you could kind of outline what grade school is and how grades work, because I was listening to it kind of learning on the fly.
So, I mean, the way the system is here, we're K-12, and in a lot of, you have your kindergartens usually straight up. Some schools go through 5th grade, some go through 6th grade, then you have middle school, then you have high school. By the time they get to high school, everybody's worried about college. And the way that they do college here is you need to have a transcript to be able to apply to college so that you have something that says you're qualified, I guess, to be there. And I could speak all day about how transcripts aren't the only way to get into college, because I've had to learn a lot about how colleges admit students, because that's one of the major arguments and pushback I get from high school teachers who say, well, we can't give up grades because we need to have report cards and we need to be doing all these things. So the way that grading works in the high school level is depending on how your school, what kind of system you're on, we were on a semester schedule. So half year, and in each of those half years, you have 3 grading periods, usually about 2 months, like a month and a half in length. And you have a midterm where you could do a progress report, and then a grade at the end. And the idea is that these grades are supposed to communicate the level that kids are performing at in whatever classes that they're taking. Unfortunately, like I said at the beginning, they don't do that. They communicate how well kids follow directions. They communicate, basically, not that communicating efforts, not a bad thing. Obviously, we want to promote a growth mindset, but what it really doesn't do is talk about process. It's only looking at products, and it's only looking at how well a student was able to do what a teacher said. I was, if you saw the TED Talk, I was an A student. I was that kid who jumped through all the hoops. I was in all honors classes. I was very compliant, at least in front of my teachers. I had whatever rebellion I needed to be doing outside of those spaces. But for the most part, I really defined myself, much to my own detriment, by what my teachers were telling me I was good at. And I'm writing a book right now for ASCD, which is all about kind of debunking that, because so much of our personal identities are attached to these validating ideas of, or maybe on the other end, not so validating, about who we are as people, depending on how these teachers grade us and the work that we do. And I mean, if I would have listened to some of my teachers, I probably wouldn't have been a writer. I always wrote, and I love to write, but I certainly, I had a 10th grade English teacher who absolutely humiliated me in front of an entire class because I didn't do it her way. She threw it up on the overhead and had the class crossing out what I did wrong, and my name was still on it. People knew that it was me, and I'm sinking in my chair while they're shredding my essay, and it stays with you. That's something.
That's very public, isn't it? If you're not a part of that process. I mean, is it part of the vernacular in your discussions that you just separate formative assessment and summative assessment in terms of grading? Because I think that's quite an important distinction to make, isn't it? That there is a need for some summative assessment, because you kind of need to know where you stand. If you're saying to a parent or yourself, how am I doing? You kind of need to know what that means in terms of, say, comparing with the general group. But formative assessment is tiny and short term, and it's a different thing. Is that how you view it? How does that fit with you?
So I kind of live in formative assessment, because I think feedback is a more valuable way to teach kids and help them progress than a grade is. I believe that when you put a grade on something, the learning ends. Students think it's done. They're not going to go back and revise when they see a grade on something. And as a writing and reading, as a literacy teacher, my biggest thing is trying to help them understand that no piece of writing is actually ever done. I mean, we might stop at some point because it doesn't make sense to keep going with it. But as we grow as writers, our voice continues to evolve, and we could look at things that we wrote years ago and go back to it, and it could evolve further if that's something we wanted to give time to. And so I think a lot of teachers, unfortunately, don't understand the distinction between formative and summative. That's definitely something that we need to work on, at least here in the United States. They don't necessarily understand that those things that are going on in the classroom every day is opportunity to assess for learning. How, have those checkpoints like John Hattie's work with visible learning, try to get kids to start expressing, how am I doing? How do I know I'm doing that? And, what are my next steps to get to where I need to go? So working a lot with goal setting, and then having really targeted formative tasks where I could give really specific feedback to them is the way that we have to be doing that. So I think you're spot on with that distinction. I think summative work is important only for that checkpoint, but still understanding that that's just a moment in time. It's not the end of the learning. It's just the end of what we're learning right now. And then we're going to pick up on that, especially in an English class where, you're constantly building on the same standards, and, they're building in complexity and sort of evolving through the years I taught mostly 12th grade. So the kids were getting ready to go to college when they were in my class usually.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've had a big revolution in England because of changes to national policy around assessment. A lot of people have been thinking about it. And Emma, what's your sense of how that's affected, your practice with, levels going and all of that? It's interesting.
Oh, do you know what? I was kind of still in year 6 when they did the abolition of national curriculum levels. And it was so interesting, just in a few months and a change of one class, how the children themselves would go from, if you ask them how they were doing, they go, oh, I'm a 3B or I'm a 4A or I'm a 5C. The conversation would change then, and they would be like, well, I really need to work on this aspect of my sentence structure, or I really need to read more about this, or I need to put this in. And like it was kind of a removal of like the tin canning of children. Like I've done this, so I can go into that can. I've done this, so I can go into that can. And it was more about really understanding them as a learner. And I was really interested, Starr, in your TED talk about when you talk about relationships, and relationships being kind of the bedrock of teaching and learning, because you can have all this skill and all this knowledge as a teacher, but unless you form that bond with the children and really understand where they're coming from, it's just not going to stick on the land. So I was thinking about, you're obviously the expert at this, so kind of what advice would you give about forming these really useful and effective professional working relationships between the teacher and the student?
So I was always one of those teachers. I also was the newspaper advisor. So my students had my cell phone, because if we were getting ready to go to print and something went badly wrong and I wasn't there, they needed to be able to get in touch with me so that I could be involved in that process. But I was super transparent with them. I was always a human being with them. There was none of this like teacher student. They were almost adults. I mean, most of them were 16, 17, 18 years old that I was teaching. They're going into the world. So I never talked down to my students ever. I treated them like I had as much to learn from them as they had to learn from me, and that I wasn't the only person in the room who had value to add to the conversation that was happening. And I think that came through in the way that I interacted with them, and they could see that, first of all, my expectations were the same of everyone. I met them where they were, but there were really rigorous expectations, regardless of where you came, except, you might have goals that were different than somebody else's. So the feedback you were getting was more targeted to what you needed. And I really didn't do a one size fits all, even though I had 34 kids in all of my classes. That's where they cap in New York City. So I had really big classes, but kids deserve it. Once you start getting them reflecting, because this is an inherent issue with assessments too. Like sometimes when we're designing assessments, we leave a lot of stuff out. We make executive decisions about what's important that needs to be assessed, thereby making choices about this stays, this doesn't stay, this is going to work, this isn't going to work. And then the kids might value that learning differently. So what I had to start trying to do was design projects that gave them opportunities to add in those blind spots that I might not see. How can they show me everything that they've learned in a way that's going to most promote their success? So it's not about making things super hard so no one can be successful. It's about knowing their strengths and then allowing them to play to their strengths while we're supporting the other stuff that is considered weak, so that they could still feel successful and get some constructive feedback, but also still get validation about the stuff that they're doing right. And even though it's an English class, doesn't mean it only has to be papers that they're submitting. They could make movies. They could design things that can show the content in different ways. And I don't need to know how to do it if they know how to do it, and I can follow it, and I can be confident enough to know that what they're conveying to me is something that's going to show, like, here are the standards, and the standards were a part of our class. We talked about them all the time. They understood the learning targets. They understood what we were doing. They had their individual goals based on the feedback they had been getting all year. And then they demonstrate their learning in these performance tasks that I was getting their input in when they were being designed. And essentially what would then end up happening is when they completed it, they had to write a standards-based reflection that told me how they felt they did on a mastery level against the particular standards we were looking at, the areas that they were working on, so that when I was looking at their final product, I was looking at it through the lens of whatever learning they were doing independently. So if they were working on, analyzing and building good evidence, that's what I was focusing on for that student. If another student was working on developing ideas or cohesion between ideas, then that was where I could give them feedback on that. And what it did was it really allowed me an opportunity to differentiate the learning in a very personalized way without adding too much extra time to the time I would have been spending looking at their work anyway. And they would do group assignments when they were learning the skills before they did the independent projects. So they had time to work it out with their peers before I assessed the learning in an independent assignment.
You're sort of involving them. Sounds like you're involving them in understanding what the success criteria, what the standards are.
Constructed
ways of responding.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different ways of sort of being excellent, but you can always improve. I'm interested in say, some whether or not you use things like Ron Berger's Austin's Butterfly video. Do you ever show that? That's like, in England, that's the most used sort of piece of training material. Austin's Butterfly, everyone's seen it, and because it's got this whole metaphor of constant improvement and positive specific feedback. Is that? Do you reference those sorts of things in your work?
So we talk about growth, like Carol Dweck's growth mindset a whole bunch, and we also kind of. By the 12th grade, they were co-constructing success criteria where we would look at exemplars and I would say, well, what do you notice about this? What makes it effective? Or is it effective? Let's start there. Is this piece an effective piece? What makes it effective? And then if you needed to replicate what's going on in this piece after we've decided it was effective, what do you need to do to be successful? And then we would backward plan together. Which of those skills do you need mini lessons on? And they were really as much a part of that conversation as I was. And I wasn't planning those 40-minute, procedural lesson plans anymore. It was very much based on being able to be on the fly with what they needed, adjusting midstream if possible, but giving them more time in class to do stuff, less time of me talking, more of them doing, and then working with them individually or in small groups to really address individual needs so that they could move forward. And that idea of helping them understand that there's always room for improvement, and I'm not the only one who could tell them, their peers could tell them as well, is how they get better. And the company that I work for, the Core Collaborative, they have some brilliant, like the impact teamwork we do, which is PLC sort of data driven conversations about student learning and clarity and formative assessment, they have brilliant videos of kindergartners who could articulate success criteria in different classes because it's so much a part of what they're doing. So
that sounds great. It's good. It's all good stuff.
I'm listening to you and I'm nodding along, because that co-construction of the success criteria from what a really good piece of writing looks like is exactly what my colleagues and I were doing in primary. And, having 3 pieces of writing, one that's kind of okay, one that's absolutely horrendous, and one that's great, and saying, why is this one better than that one, and what are the features of this one? And it's, I don't think necessarily as many teachers as could have really high expectations of the children in terms of actually what they understand about success criteria and about identifying what makes a good piece of work. I mean, Tom's a massive advocate of direct and explicit instruction, and he'll talk about that all day long, but alongside that is that culture of high expectations for kind of the metacognitive side of things, the co-construction of success criteria. And it's not just the older children that can do that. And I was so pleased you just said that the kindergartners could do that as well, because they do know what good stuff looks like.
Yeah.
They do. And what's crazy is some of my colleagues in the high school would be reticent about giving kids opportunities to be more autonomous in their learning. And I'd be like, do you go down to the elementary school and see how second graders could be left in small groups to do work, and they actually do the work and they're capable? So if an 8-year-old can do it, why can't a 16-year-old do it? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's all about the culture you build in your space and the expectations you have of kids in that space.
But links to things like what Dylan Williams says about activating students as owners of their own learning and so on. It's all good stuff. And so, listen, it's brilliant talking to you. I think we've kind of run out of time for our segment here, but it's been really fantastic talking to you, Starr. Fascinating, honestly. And I think if you're out there wanting to get some ideas about assessment, and Starr's book is brilliant, so check it out. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
so much.
Another brilliant conversation, this time with Starr Sackstein. My mind was going at 1,000,000 miles an hour throughout that, especially watching you, Tom. I know you've got a lot going on in that head. So what were your thoughts as Starr was talking?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting that this agenda about formative assessment is, it's universal. And I know, from what I know about US assessment, this grade point average is a big thing, and there's a lot of talk about I'm a 3.6 or a 3.8 or whatever, and that kind of number and grading is a huge deal. So everything that we've been talking about in the UK around formative assessment, ever since Dylan Williams published Inside the Black Box, is clearly resonating there. And she's feeling like she's, it's almost like championing a movement to engage in a more authentic process of assessment, which for her is all about getting students to understand success and be involved in the process. So I think it's interesting. I think in this world, we're trying to talk about mind the gap, and you've got to come at things from different perspectives, and you can see her perspective there was clearly sort of against this whole formalization of report grading and stuff. So I thought that was really interesting, and she's got a lot of practical ideas from her perspective as a high school English teacher to involve students in understanding what excellence looks like and how to engage them. So yeah, I thought that was great, and I think she's the voice of an authentic teacher there, wrestling with an issue, which and I think that's so exciting to hear someone finding that kind of voice. And her book, Hacking Assessment, is 10 very specific things to do, which is worth looking at. Obviously, we only scratched the surface in that short conversation in a way. And what about you? What I could see that the whole thing that we've been through with taking away levels and stuff, we've been discussing the things at different ends of the age range, I suppose. So what was your take?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of what she was saying was stuff that we've been doing in primary for a long time, and quite successfully. And it really, as I said, chimed with me when she said about the removal of grades from children, how that completely changed their attitudes towards the subjects. And I saw that firsthand when national curriculum levels were removed. And I really like the idea, again, about her really hammering home the fact that it's kind of relationships first. But something we didn't touch on, which I would have liked to have explored more, is that all of that model that she was talking about relies on huge swathes of really detailed teacher subject knowledge, to be that nimble and that agile in setting target, individualized pupil targets and next steps, and identifying the little bits and nuances of what children and students need to do. We didn't touch on the fact that actually you have to be a hugely knowledgeable, skillful teacher in order to do that to best effect.
Yeah.
I would have liked to explore that with her. And also the idea of curriculum coverage, as in what do you teach in your curriculum to then be that kind of nimble and agile within it, and to set up that formative assessment. So if we had her back on again, I'd like to unpick a little bit more about teacher subject knowledge and curriculum.
And to be honest with you, an assessment is an enormous area. There's a lot of value in talking about whole class feedback as part of the diet, so you get a lot of feedback generated, as well as what she was focusing more, which is very individualized, because that creates a bit of a workload pressure if you feel.
I did think that.
No, so there's anyway. But I as a opening sort of exploratory discussion with someone from a different context to ours, I thought that was really really interesting. As I kind of, you could see her enthusiasm, and we had as much chat after we stopped recording as during it, because there's so much more to say. That's the way it goes, isn't it?
And it wasn't at all me bemoaning transition procedures at all, Tom.
There's a lot to be said for all those things. Now, one of my favourite assessment stories was when a head teacher told me, it was like a joke. She said, I'm really proud to say every single one of my children knows the level that they're at if you ask them. She said, the only trouble is it's always 5B, which is the joke, because in other words, they had learnt to get everyone off their back, you just say 5B and everyone leaves you alone.
He's here all night, folks.
Assessment jokes are the funniest, It's the way I tell them.
Oh God, Tom, you're not going to get out of consultancy anytime soon.